Hello everyone, welcome back to History 201. This week you're looking at Mexican American women. You have an article that focuses on that. You will have a discussion amongst you all addressing the article itself. But I want to give you a little bit of context in regards to the material and how race plays a role in shaping these young women's identity. This is a subject that I am very familiar. It's something I specialize, which is Mexican American women. So we'll be looking at, I guess somewhat of a precursor to what you read in order to understand why they feel the way they felt, the way the article addresses it. So this is this is a great picture looking at the 1920s. This is a wedding picture. And, it kind of just shows the fashion and, young Mexican American women who are coming into their own around the 1920s, and you can tell that's the 20s because of the clothing, right? It's showing a lot more skin, as you can see up there, right? So it's a very fascinating period to study when it comes to women's history. So let me begin by addressing the generation before the article. Before what the article talks about. Now, this is what historians, at least Mexican American historians, have defined as the immigrant generation. From the previous lectures, I've talked about how immigrants are coming to the United States in large numbers from Italy and Eastern Europe, but they're also coming from Mexico. So a lot of times when we think of Mexicans, we think that they recently arrived, and we find that that's incorrect. Not only have they been here because this used to be part of Mexico, but around the 1900s they began to come in larger numbers because of some of the same reasons that Italians were coming over. So that's why Chicano historians have defined this period as the immigrant generation. And they're coming for multiple reasons. Some historians have labeled this a push factor. When it comes to immigration, they're coming because of things that they're experiencing in their home country. So in Mexico, you have a dictator. His name is Porfirio Diaz. He's one of the heroes from Cinco de Mayo, some battle in Mexico, in Puebla, in the 1860s. And he becomes president, and he essentially runs the country as a dictator. Now, what's important here to us is that Porfirio Diaz invites all this kind of foreign investment from Europe and the United States and kicks people off their land in Mexico. He's trying to industrialize Mexico. So you begin to see this kind of commercial agriculture increase in Mexico, where the land is stripped from the people that used to farm it, used to work it and cultivate it, and given essentially to American corporations. There's a great example in northern Mexico where Yaqui native people had a stretch of land, and what he does is actually gathers them and puts them on a train and sends them down to the Yucatan. So it just gives you an idea of what kind of president this man was, where he literally moves people off the land. So this causes an upheaval by the working class people in Mexico. So part of his policies was really to invest in Mexico, but the consumptions of these goods were not for Mexico. They were for foreign entities. So things like some of the food that was being produced in Mexico wasn't for the people in Mexico to eat, but rather the food was being exported to places like the United States or places like Europe, so their working class could eat this food. And a good example of this is something like beets. Mexicans don't eat beets. Mexicans probably don't even know what a beet is. But that becomes an important staple that's being produced in Mexico, and rather than beans, which is a major staple of the Mexican diet, right? So we see how Porfirio Diaz begins to favor these big corporations. If you can remember too, Porfirio Diaz, and when I talk about homosexuality, that event happened around his time, and it began to be tied to his regime. So people already hated Porfirio Diaz for that and other reasons too. So in 1910, you had what's called the Mexican Revolution. And I'm not going to dig into Mexican history here, but it's important because it forces people to move from different places in Mexico into either the urban spaces like Mexico City, or particularly people that live at the northern border. It forces them to move outside of Mexico because they don't want to be part of this conflict. They want stability. So many of them migrate to the United States. So this is a major push factor. Now, when it comes to immigration, it's not just people wanting to leave a bad situation. If they had the option to stay, they would. But there's also a pull factor. People are being enticed to come to the United States. Understand that the United States does not function in a vacuum here when it comes to immigration. Even today, right? A lot of corporations want cheap labor. And it's no different today as it was back then. Corporations used to travel to Europe, to the United States, to try to entice people to migrate to the United States so they can be cheap labor. So this is something that we see where a lot of Mexicans are coming to the United States. At this time, one of the major ports of entries was El Paso, but it's an open border. There's no fences, there's no walls, there's nothing. It's just a line in the sand, and people are just migrating because, again, the situation is bad in Mexico, but there are opportunities in the United States too. So the reason why they come is for stability, for jobs, and there are many jobs in the United States. Many of them stay within the southern border, places like Texas, places like California, Los Angeles being a hotspot. But also some of them go all the way to Chicago and even Minnesota. What's the name of the town? There's a book called Northern Barrios. No, Barrios Norteños, sorry. And it talks about these Mexican American communities that date back to the 1920s and 30s. These are just some of the heroes of the Mexican Revolution. So when many of these people began to settle in places like Los Angeles and Tucson and El Paso and so forth, San Antonio, they began to create this idea of Mexico. Not of the United States, but of Mexico. And we still see it today. If you go, across the Highway 10 to Avondale, particularly Old Avondale, you still see, carnicerias, panaderias. You see all these things that remind these immigrants of home. And so this is a very common experience. You could go to New York and you could see Little Italy's over there, right? Or Minnesota, and there's like Little Poland over there, because they bring their culture and they try to reestablish it on this side of the border, which kind of goes along with my lecture on progressives. If you can remember that many of these immigrants don't want to be American. They don't want to assimilate. They want to maintain their culture. And we see that happening here where many of them join organizations called mutual aid societies or mutualistas. And in these organizations, they create this sense of identity as a collective that's tied to their home country. If you ever go to places like Mexico or even Italy, Italy, the southern part of Italy kind of hates the northern part because there's a sense of, favoritism towards the north, and there's more poverty in the south. If you go to Mexico, people from Guadalajara hate people from Mexico City. So there's friction within the country, but once they leave and they migrate to this new place called the United States, they try to find common bonds with the people that speak like they do or look like they do or have the same kind of cultural traits. So they create this concept called, at least for Mexican Americans, called Mexican de afuera. And they create a melting pot of Mexican identity, but on this side of the border, in Los Angeles, in San Antonio, and so forth, and places like Chicago. So at one time they might have hated each other, they might have hated people from Mexico City, people from Guadalajara. But now that's all they have, and again, that's what kind of holds them together is that common culture. They become friends on this side of the border. Their organizations, the mutual aid organizations, reflect the cultural background, right? Confederaciones de Sociedades Mexicanas or Hijos de Mexico. Their their identity is directly linked to the mother country. And you see that even today. I mean, when Mexico plays the United States in soccer, I'm always torn. My parents aren't. They easily go for Mexico, even though they've been living here for over 40 years, actually over 50 years. For them, home will always be Mexico, not the United States. And in doing so, they create these festivals. You know, they're celebrating Mexico as much and whenever they can. So they create these festivals, such as Cinco de Mayo, December 12th, which is the Day of the Virgen de Guadalupe, the Day of the Dead, and the other one is September 16th, right? Independence Day. And a good example of that is Cinco de Mayo, where in Mexico, nobody celebrates Cinco de Mayo, besides Puebla. Outside of that area, Cinco de Mayo is not celebrated. However, on this side of the border, it is, because many Mexicans wanted to feel like they were closer to Mexico. So they people from Puebla started celebrating it. Other people from different parts of Mexico within the United States are celebrating it with them. And before you know it, I think by the 1950s or even 60s, it becomes a national holiday on this side of the border, where Americans begin to celebrate Cinco de Mayo. So it started off just them trying to have this event that ties them together, and it begins to kind of reflect into American culture. Again, in Mexico, it's never really celebrated. And many of these Mexicans have what's called the Mexican dream. So even though we're constantly being told that immigrants came around this period of time and they believed in the American dream, as I told you, that's nonsense. About 30% of them go back to their home country by the 1930s. Many of them have not the American dream, but the Mexican dream. They hope to go back to Mexico one day. And that is very common in many of these immigrants' experiences. They see that their time here as temporary, not as something that's going to last. Once they start having kids, which is related to the article that you read, things begin to change. And there's another picture of them celebrating, I think, Cinco de Mayo. Yeah, in 1925. So this used to be a very Mexican holiday. Now, every Dick and Jane is Mexican on Cinco de Mayo, right? Maybe people just want to drink. I'll stop it here and we'll continue this lecture in a minute.